Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on benchmarking and more specifically on hard questions and disputes in TNMM benchmarking. Today, we would be talking about the way tax authorities are challenging your benchmarks, but more fundamentally, what is the future of transfer pricing disputes surrounding benchmarking studies. My name is Borys, and I'm a founder and CEO of ArmsLength AI. By my background, I'm a transfer pricing professional. But about 4 years ago, I took a bit of crazy decision of moving from the traditional transfer pricing career into transfer pricing technology. And then shortly after, with the launch of ChatGPT and with the rapid progress of LLMs and AI more broadly, we started building ArmsLength AI, which is a transfer pricing technology solution or a transfer pricing technology company which builds solutions for automating transfer pricing workflows and just making transfer pricing better. Today with me, my colleague and my co-founder, my friend Sven. Sven, a couple of words about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Borys. So I'm Sven. I joined Borys as a co-founder in ArmsLength AI. Before joining ArmsLength AI, I worked as a transfer pricing professional. I have a background in finance and tax, but I was always very passionate about technology and data analytics. So I built those kind of tools and services myself before joining ArmsLength AI. And this is very exciting to now work together with Borys on AI integrated solutions for transfer pricing.
Thank you, Sven. Very excited. Just a couple of alternative facts from Borys. So this is a special category in our webinars from now on. First of all, we have discovered that arm's length is a AMO band in Canada. So there is such a band, and they have perfect merge. So you can expect us wearing funny arm's length merge of that band from the next webinar going on. And also while we are recording the webinar, we have at least, I think, 4 or 5 AI agents now doing the work instead of us in the background. And that's why we've made this time to do the webinar today. That's a half joke, of course. But talking about AI and transfer pricing, and more specifically about benchmarks, the reason why we believed it's a good point to reflect on transfer pricing disputes around benchmarking is that we see that the future where benchmarks will become much more disputed comparing to the past. So there were some disputes already around benchmarking studies, and we will go through some of them in this webinar, highlighting the key dispute points and positions of the taxpayers and tax authorities, and trying to draw some conclusions around to how to behave, how to do better benchmarks, how tax authorities challenge them actually. But the thing is that benchmarks is often a weak spot of transfer pricing analysis that taxpayers present in front of tax authorities or in the disputes. However, they are not as often disputed as some other transfer pricing points. And our strong feel is the reason behind that is that benchmarking is not the highest ROI item on the menu of tax authorities when they start challenging transfer pricing. It's pretty cumbersome and just time inefficient to go and challenge every benchmark. If you can go and challenge some other areas of transfer pricing where you can recharacterize the entity, even though that's also related, of course, to benchmarking. There are those cases, but they are of benchmark disputes, but they are not as often appearing in the list of disputes that we see coming up in our feed. And the reason is, of course, if you go and review the benchmark, you often end up redoing benchmarking study if you're a tax authority. And this is just resource intensive and takes a lot of time, and especially if you want to do an analysis of hundreds of benchmarks that your taxpayers submit to you, that's not very effective. However, with AI and with the technology that we have now, it is 100% possible already today to actually analyze benchmarks at much larger scale in automated way and spending much less time and getting much higher return on investment on hours that tax authorities are putting into this challenge process or review process. And the reason why we know that is that we already onboarded several tax authorities in Europe that started already using our solution, AI benchmarks, to either do benchmarks that taxpayers haven't done, do alternative benchmarks, or challenge existing benchmarks that taxpayers are already preparing. So that's point number one. Point number two is that you need to be aware that the benchmarks that you are doing today will be challenged in a few years from now, because typically the transfer pricing audit cycle is pretty long. So the current year, like year 2026, will most probably be audited in 2029 or 2030. We typically see that tax authorities would go 3 years, 5 years, sometimes 7 years back, depending on what local regulations does. And if you think about the technology that will be available to tax authorities in 5 years, you can be 100% sure that they will have substantially more capabilities to dispute any aspect of transfer pricing, including benchmarking studies. And that's why it's super important to do good benchmarks already now and take this problem seriously. Sven, over to you for a quick run through the agenda.
Yeah, so what we will be discussing today, we will discuss the topics that are all parts of the whole benchmarking process. So we start by how are benchmarks actually being disputed today. Then we will discuss the functional profile, because that's where the benchmark actually starts. Then the resulting search strategy, then the comparable selection, and then how you select the POI. And in the end, we will give a brief demonstration of how ArmsLength AI, our benchmark solutions, can help you to perform these benchmarks in a more efficient and consistent way.
Great. So yeah.
How are benchmarks disputed? Well, to do that properly, you need to do actually two things as a tax authority. So you start, so you don't just look at the final result and say it's wrong. You have to go through the entire process that the taxpayer went through, because there's this presumption that the taxpayer is right in case they filed some transfer pricing documentation. Then we have the assumption that the taxpayer is right. So you first need to demonstrate as a tax authority that the taxpayer did something wrong. And that can be anywhere in the process. So that starts with who was the right, what's the transaction that we're looking at, and which party within this transaction should we be testing? Which one is the tested party? Then based on the selection of the tested party, you need to define a functional profile for that entity, which really goes into detail on, well, what are the value drivers for this entity, and which functions, assets, and risks is this entity employing to perform those functions. Then based on that search strategy, we define filters for the benchmark. So which filters can be used to reliably identify comparable entities, and why do you apply each filter, and those should tie back to your search strategy or to the functional profile of the entity and the economic analysis that's next to it. And then the final part of your benchmark should be the question whether the rejections are actually consistent. So do you consistently apply the same accept rejection made strategy for each company inside your set? And that's, so you need to do these 4 steps to be able to or as a tax authority, you can you can attack one of these points to scrutinize their existing range and their existing margin. And once you've done that, you need to do the same again to demonstrate that you have a better range, or a better, more appropriate arm's length range for this transaction. I think that's the next step. So you look at the original study, you identify weaknesses, you demonstrate that these weaknesses are actually relevant, so that they have an economic impact on the resulting range, that they result in comparability defects that are serious. Then you need to perform an alternative analysis, and that an alternative analysis needs to be strong in itself as well, because the taxpayer can also attack the alternative analysis performed by the tax authority. So you really need to have this whole audit flow, or as a tax authority, you need to do a lot of steps to attack a benchmark and a range for a operational transaction, which is a lot of work. At least it used to be a lot of work, and now we're seeing that this becomes less and less work, which makes it more and more dangerous for taxpayers. But yeah, let's first look at an existing case where the taxpayer extensive, or where the tax authorities did challenge a benchmark from a taxpayer. I think the next slide. So this
one is a very good case, because first of all, I saw that's the other sneakers company. I thought that's about chocolate, but apparently it was not.
Yeah, so this is about indeed a Latvian shoe production company. They create workwear for their headquarters in Sweden, and they are a routine manufacturer. And at the end of the year, they got an they adjusted the profit downwards because the range that they calculated was lower than the actual margin that they got. So they adjusted their profit downwards, and then the tax authorities challenged this adjustments. And the way that they did this was by looking at the benchmark that the taxpayer used, which contained 80 companies, of which none actually did anything in clothing, had anything to do with clothing. So the tax authority said, okay, obviously this is not a good benchmark. They are manufacturers of cars, car parts, those kind of products and services. So we should reject the benchmark, and we will redo the benchmark ourselves. And this is actually the range that you should have. And the range that the tax authorities came up with was a bit higher. So the calculated margin, or the actual margin that they got during the year, was within that range. So they said no adjustment is allowed because you're within the range. Well, the lower court accepted this argument. They indeed said this benchmark is not good. But then the Supreme Court said, well, indeed, the products are not related to clothing, but the OECD guidelines don't demand that you actually have to produce the same products or services. You just need to do a similar function. And if the products and services have similar economic characteristics, they can still result in a acceptable set of comparables. You don't need exact matches in your comparables. So that was really interesting. On the one hand, you would say, okay, obviously this is very, very different, these kind of goods and products that are manufactured. But still the court said, because the tax authorities didn't make a clear argument why these different products and services are economically different from the goods and services that Snickers produces, the tax authorities didn't successfully demonstrate that the comparables are bad. So
which is crazy.
Yeah.
Which is crazy, right? Because like if you think about assets for manufacturing car parts and assets for manufacturing clothing, I mean, I can manufacture clothing at home, but it would be very hard for me to manufacture car parts at home, even though I have 3D printer.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the Supreme Court went way out of its way. Again, it's the Supreme Court. It referred this case back to the lower court. So the lower court may end up in deciding that indeed the benchmark was bad, and that the benchmark performed by the tax authorities was better. But still, it's just funny. I think it does emphasize how important it is to have a proper economic argument for almost all decisions within your benchmark. We will later also see that this doesn't only apply to the tax authority, but also to the taxpayer. So both sides need to have economic arguments for why a defect in the comparability can have material impact on the resulting range. So that's probably the most important takeaway.
Yeah. And probably it's also important to mention that that's pretty old case. So since then, transfer pricing regimes and generally transfer pricing as industry evolved quite far away from where it was. Hard to imagine this case happening now.
Yeah, definitely, especially because the court or the Supreme Court even accepted the fact that the taxpayer didn't provide the filters that it applied to the within the benchmark. They didn't tell which filters they used, so it was impossible for the tax administration to replicate the benchmark. Well, I don't think that this is a good position to go for, but still, yeah, it just shows that as a tax authority, it's just better to have a lot of economic arguments in your case than have too few. And the same goes for taxpayers, which we will see later.
Very cool. All right, moving on to the next topic, which is functional profile. And I know we have a pretty cool case coming up, but let's just discuss that first on a high level. Sven?
Yeah, so to determine which functions you want to benchmark, you of course need to do a functional analysis, but what I said is it's important to have this economic mindset, right? Which functions, assets and risks are actually material and which ones should you focus on most? And one way to think about this, or in a more structured way, and a way that helps you to identify the most critical risks, most critical assets, and the most critical functions, is by starting to look at the assets that are used within the transaction. So these can be material and immaterial. But imagine this manufacturer of clothes. So what kind of assets do they have? Well, they have a manufacturing facility or some kind of plant. They will have some kind of equipment, and they will have materials. And probably the most important decisions for this business that the business owners around this business need to take are around those assets. Like, okay, are we going to do the investment for this plant? How many pieces of equipment are we going to take? What will be our utilization of this equipment? And so all of the follow-up questions and the questions on risks and decisions that are most relevant will flow from this asset first perspective. So I think that's a bit of a different way of thinking than what we've seen recently. There's a lot of focus on risks, but risks are really difficult. You have an endless number of risks that are involved in every business, and it's difficult to prioritize risks. But if you start looking at assets, it's easier to prioritize on which risks you need to focus, and that again helps you to focus on what are the most important elements in your benchmark to base your search strategy on.
Exactly. And that also applies to all type of assets, right? So intangible assets would follow the same logic, where you might have a brand, and then you might have a local distributor, and who is actually responsible for that brand locally, who actually invests in that brand, who makes decisions around that brand locally as well. So it all applies not just to tangible, but also to intangible assets. And then the risks are also downstream of that.
Yeah, and IP the same, right? So you may have an R&D center that produces or that creates IP, but if the actual decision making on employing this R&D center is taken somewhere else, and they have the capacity, the financial capacity to take on that risks, then it's still justified to assign the assets, the ownership of the assets, to the one that's employing the R&D center.
Yep, agree. Very good. And now another case, which is a little bit sweeter than not the right Snickers, because this one will be about pineapples.
Yeah, so about a really big pineapple production facility in Kenya. So they were qualified in this benchmark as just a routine manufacturer or producer of pineapples, which sounds straightforward and sounds also pretty benchmarkable. But then if you look into the details, the facility that we're talking about here was actually by far the biggest facility in Kenya. So by far the biggest producer of pineapples in Kenya and possibly in the whole world. So they have a really significant position. So that also helps to understand why the tax authorities challenge the position of the taxpayer, because the taxpayer said, okay, this is just a routine producer of pineapples, and we will benchmark it with similar products or with similar companies, but they couldn't find other pineapple producers because the data in Africa...
Because they out-competed already, all of them probably.
Yeah, because it's just such a good production facility. Yeah, so or farm. So they benchmarked it against banana production farms and some other similar goods. And in this case, the tax authority said, well, bananas, we're talking about pineapples here. The bananas are incomparable. And well, the court in this case said, well, you're completely right, tax authority. Bananas are incomparable, or the taxpayer didn't demonstrate that the bananas are economically comparable to pineapples. So we're rejecting these comparables, and we're rejecting your whole benchmark, therefore. Completely different approach from the Latvian case, but still it's sort of hangs around the same arguments, but from a different perspective. And then they they rejected the benchmark, and then they looked at the overall value chain and said, hey, look at the number of activities that this canyon facility is performing. They do the cultivation, production, planning, processing, warehousing, quality control, transport. So actually they perform all the significant functions within this value chain. And therefore, this should be the principal or the entrepreneur, and the other side, which was a German distributor, they should receive a routine remuneration. And then they ended up in a crazy chain of thought where they said, okay, what's the right margin for this canyon or the German facility, or the right price for this transaction? And they made this argument from, okay, what's the price that people pay at the shop? Then they subtracted margins for the retailer, they subtracted margins for the wholesaler, they subtracted margins for VAT, for other import levies, and I said, okay, so that's the price that Kenyan producers should receive.
And 5% markup on low value adding services.
Yeah, and 5% markup for low value adding services of the German entity, which is a really big brand, really big name, has all connections to all supermarkets. So definitely not fully in line with the intentions of the OECD behind the low value adding services, but still they did it. Not sure whether it's representative of other countries, but yeah, you do need to have a good story in place.
Thanks, Kenya, for bringing up so many interesting transfer pricing cases. All right, let's move on. So the next step, and let's assume at this point you have defined your functional profile that you're going to test, and you have a good idea about the split of functions and activities and through assets as we discussed. Now it's time to move on to the next step, which is search strategy definition. And here, when I talk about search strategy, I will be talking more about database strategy. So we're not talking about like particular manual review of the comparables in detail. We're talking about higher level perspective. And to define that search target, what you can call, you need to understand what kind of companies are you actually going to search for. So you need to have a working hypothesis of what is realistic to find on the market that will be sufficiently comparable to the target that we're searching for. So let's say, well, manufacturer of pineapples or contract manufacturer of clothing, right? So that would be a high-level type of definition of what we're searching for. And there are several approaches that are used in practice there. Of course, typically you would go for the NACE code, but NACE code on itself, you can't say we will search for all companies in a particular set of NACE codes. That would be too broad, that would be not defined sufficiently. The better start is not to start with the nice codes, but better to define what kind of company are you actually looking for. So we have here an example which is coming from our real practice, where we had a benchmark about a year ago where we were asked to help on preparing it. So the company that we were helping to test was a virgin olive oil distributor in Germany. So that was the tested party. And then our immediate thought was, well, we will go and search for German oil distributors. Well, we probably realized already at that point that virgin olive oil would be too narrow. So let's go for German olive oil distributors. That was our hypothesis of what we're going to search for, that what we are going to find. If you pause here for a second, you will quickly realize that that assumption, that hypothesis of what you're going to find might be a bit unrealistic already at this point, even before you go into extracting companies from the database and processing them through manual or AI review. Because Germany is not an oil-producing country. We can't expect a big sector of olive oil distributors in Germany. And in reality, most of those type of companies are actually located in Southern Europe, where olive oil is grown, and then those growers, those producers are selling them, might sell them to some distributors that will then be distributing it around Europe. Probably a lot of them would also have quite a strong brand, but that's the other thing. And then, do you realistically expect to find German olive oil distributors? Would be a question that you should ask yourself before you go into details. And we started with that narrow definition, and we quickly realized that that is too narrow. So what we've done, we extracted based on most closest NACE codes, went through our solution, and then it analyze the companies, and there were quite a large initial set, and we quickly realized there are just no except. So basically no German olive oil distributors exist that are independent and pass the initial filtering. And then we took a step back and did a bit of more functional analysis type of consideration and economic analysis, and we quickly realized that olive oil is probably not too different from other types of non-perishable goods. When you think about distribution, so the distribution value chain for distribution of other types of products that are non-perishable, meaning they're not spoiling if they are not stored in the refrigerators, should be good enough comparable for this type of benchmarking study. So we may want to accept companies that are not just olive oil distributors, but just perishable food items distributors. Of course, we could go a step further and say, well, all consumer good distributors is a right strategy, but that would probably be too broad. And that's what we're talking here, right? Look at assets, look at stock, look at how they're processing stock, look at what assets they use in the process, and what are the typical functions and risks that those companies have. And if olive oil or other product is not as specific and as unique, then you can expand the search in terms of functional comparability. And with services, it will look a little bit different, where you probably need to look at the complexity of the services and uniqueness of the services that you are going to compare. And then you have two options. So you can broaden the search geographically. You could say, let's go for olive oil distributors, but let's include other countries as well, not just Germany in our case, but also all Europe, Southern Europe should be also included. Or the alternative would be, that's what I think we ultimately went for, is let's also broaden the product scope. So let's not just look at the olive oil, but let's look more broadly at other products as well. So you have this trade-off, and it's not always clear. So you need to consider market dynamics, how different those countries are actually. But I think for European developed countries, it's typically okay to include broader geography.
Yeah, and I think so. When you create your report, it's really good to emphasize or to have a section on this search strategy, right? So how did we came up with the search strategy that's actually being used inside this benchmark? And maybe even reference like, okay, we initially did a search specifically for olive oil that ended up with 0 comparables, so we expanded the search criteria, and because of these characteristics of the other products and services that we now include in the scope, we think they are economically comparable to the tested transaction.
Exactly. All right, and now we can move on to the next step, which is comparable selection. So that's once you defined your filters and criteria initially and extracted companies from the database, it's time to go and analyze the companies in more detail and look at what particular companies are doing, not just from the broad-based filtering, but from more granular perspective, actually checking their websites, actually checking their descriptions, sometimes checking their 10Ks if those are public companies, to understand the nuance of every company. And the thing here is that it's about finding the right balance between rejecting too strictly and accepting too easily and accepting too broadly. The example here would be, yeah, I think the important point here is that every company is unique. So if you look at any sector and any company, you cannot find perfect comparable. We all realize that. So it's important to understand what are those rejection criteria that are really important for this particular benchmarking study. And I'll give you an example of brand. So brand is typically quite important for more market-facing activities like distribution and retail, or product production that is consumer-facing, B2C type of products. Therefore, if a distributor has a strong, potentially comparable distributor, and your benchmarking distributor have a strong brand, puts its brand on products, and what you benchmark is you don't have a local strong brand that you're analyzing, or the tested party doesn't have it, or you want to strip it, because that's probably default situation that you want to strip distributors that have brands, because we typically would say that that's a limited risk company, right? That it shouldn't have a strong local brand. For distribution activity, brand is super important, and typically owning a strong local brand would be a factor that would reject a distributor, potential comparable distributor. But if you think about other type of activity, which is contract manufacturing, for example, and contract manufacturer that, or just generally manufacturer of that works on the toll manufacturing scheme, the potential comparable does have some brand, but they still primarily perform manufacturing on-demand activity where they are asked to produce certain type of goods for other companies. The fact that they have some own brand, which is on their website, they would have some name, some logo, that typically is not important, or not as important as in distribution activity. Because if you are, let's say, a business that orders manufacturing services or asks someone to manufacture something for you, and they don't put their brands on the product, then the fact that they do own some brand doesn't matter as much. So in this case, owning the brand is not as important factor, and you may go with accepting the companies that have some brand, and all of them probably do have it. And here we're coming to the next Kenyan transfer pricing case, or transfer pricing dispute. And here we're talking about the situation where the comparable companies might perform or might operate in other sectors that are not as comparable as the tested party. So here the case was in Kenya, where there was a local distributor, pharmaceutical distributor called Cipla, and that was an Indian company that had Kenyan representative distributor. And then the tax authorities challenged that benchmark on the basis of the fact that some of the comparables that the taxpayer included in their benchmarking study were operating with other types of products, like veterinary products, botanical drugs, some herbal supplements, which are not clearly the medical pharmaceutical grade type of product. And it's valid. So overall, this logic makes sense, and it's something that we also heard from the previous Kenyan case with bananas and pineapples, right? So that might hold to some degree, and you would expect that, let's say, in pharmaceuticals, you have more regulations. So they have probably some more activities to do, some more functions to perform around registering the products locally, et cetera, and therefore comparing them to supplements would not be a very good comparable. But the crazy thing here is that tax authority, or well, I shouldn't say crazy, is that tax authority said your benchmark is not good enough and includes not comparable products or no companies that operate in non-comparable markets. And therefore, since it is not a perfect benchmark, you should make an adjustment, or we will make an adjustment to the median of the range. So they didn't say your benchmark is flawed and therefore we make another benchmark. They didn't say we will now exclude companies from your benchmark and recalculate the range. They said you have a range, but since it is in perfect range, you should adjust to the median of the range to account for those differences and to just capture that complexity of the data set that you have, or divergence of the data set that you have. Does it make sense, Sven, do you think?
Yeah, well, to an degree, I do see where they're coming from. So if you look at the OECD guidelines, they reference the fact that, well, if you have perfect comparables, you can use the full range within your of your benchmark, right? You can use every comparable as a good comparable and use that margin as a acceptable margin. So effectively, your range becomes the lowest and maximum value within your set of comparables. That's in case you have really good comparables. But then they say if the comparability is not great, or there are some concerns on comparability, we reduce this range to the interquartile range, which is what mostly is applied, of course, because no two companies are the same. So generally, it's a good idea to say, okay, there's no perfect comparability, so the interquartile range is a fair assessment of the risk profile of the tested entity. And then you can take it even further, which Kenyon did, saying, well, the set of comparables is so, there's so many defects. Even this range is too much. We should just go to the median, because that's in the end the safest value within, and that's the safest value, and the most likely to be then correct. But I don't know whether it's the most logical approach. Of course, in my view, if you indeed identify a few comparables which you disagree with and the others you agree with, then it makes more sense to just disallow those other those less comparable entities and focus on the more comparable entities and look at the range that's resulting from that, and then assess whether the margin is within that range, and if so, then accept the margin. If not, adjust to the median of the range.
Right, and it seems that Tribunal agreed with your argument. Okay, and yeah, that's exactly what Sven has just discussed about using the full range versus interquartile range, and what we do with extreme values. It's really compelling to try to go for the full range, and even some countries are prescribing that as a default option, right? For example, in Canada, they proactively, tax authorities and regulations mandate use of full range instead of interquartile range, which puts more pressure. And I think it kind of makes sense behaviorally, because it makes taxpayers think more seriously and critically about the companies that they include in their comparable set. And the reason for that is that then the lowest, or the company in your comparable set with the lowest margin and highest margin, become two most important comparables in your set. And then if tax authorities can disregard your top and lower or lowest comparable, depending on what the position is, then it can move the range more significantly and easily. And with interquartile range, it's not the case. But I think HMRC as well, generally now, in their latest consultation document, said that using a full range is generally preferred, kind of softly. But I think the reality is that it's super difficult to find really good comparables in many cases.
Yeah.
Especially
and I think using the full range for price setting doesn't make sense, but full range for price setting sort of makes sense. You should see it as, okay, you're performing a certain function, and if you look at comparable companies, you're performing a certain function, and that function has a risk profile, right? So, and the risk profile can be either resulting in a more positive result or a more negative result. But generally, you would expect the median as your expected return, but then it can go really well or it can go really poorly. And using the full range better reflects this range of risk that you're taking. But to properly use this, I would say that you need to still target at the start of the year the median, and then have really good operational TP in place to correctly allocate risks that are being taken by the tested party, and allocate them towards the tested party. And if those risks materialize and you end up lower, then that's fine, because those risks should be allocated towards the tested party, and the other way around should also be acceptable. So that's my theoretical point of view on this.
Yep. Cool. And here we're coming to PLI selection problem. And here we will just jump straight into the case. So there is a case of or dispute in Czechia, where the taxpayer, as a manufacturer, as a local manufacturer, used a specific type of PLI, which is called return on value added costs. In simple words, it means that they have applied markup not on total costs associated with the manufacturing process, but they have excluded certain types of costs and applied a markup only on part of the cost where they believe that they are adding value with those type of costs, and then material costs, which is cost of goods sold, essentially, in accounting terms, most often shouldn't be marked up, because that part is not where the company adds substantial value. It adds substantial value by transforming the materials, and therefore those costs are only relevant for markup. And then the authority's position was that since the company actually bought, owned, stored, and processed those materials, those costs should be marked up as well. So it's not only about benchmarking with the potentially comparable companies, but it's also about how do you apply that markup that your result is, and is it even one markup that you should apply? Sven, do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, I have thoughts on this.
Yes, please.
But I will keep it brief. Yeah, so I have some concerns about this because, well, generally you don't have really great data availability on the split between material costs, so the cost of goods sold, and the OPEX. Well, you may have it in your statements, but you don't know the exact way that this has been classified. So it's not super reliable to find good comparable data on this. And second, so what you're essentially doing is saying, hey, we're benchmarking these companies that do own the risks of processing the materials, and they get a sort of markup on top of all of those costs, right? But then in this, and then you apply that markup instead of over the full cost base, just over their OPEX. But you're not sure whether the margin that they earn is fully one-on-one related to each euro in the cost base. Maybe the OPEX actually gets a higher return, a higher margin than the cost, the material cost. So that whole logic is a bit shaky to me. Yeah. And that's why I feel like I'm not sure whether this is a great approach.
Yeah. So be careful with applying exotic ways of applying markup on your costs, and have a super strong arguments of why you do that. And I think one of the ideas that we discussed before is that maybe you might have different markups on different type of costs. That's probably plausible, but having no markup on significant costs if you own and buy and store the materials is probably a bit extreme.
Yeah, and definitely you have some costs if they are really in your balance sheet, then you have some equity allocated towards those goods, and then they are saying that you don't get any margin for this fact, and that's that's a bit extreme.
Yeah. Very good. So we came through the whole process of benchmarking and starting from the functional and economic analysis. What does the party do? Who controls risks? Who controls assets? And how this whole process works, to defining the search strategy based on those initial, based on that first part of the analysis, which is, I think, still the most important part of transfer pricing, is defining who does what, and if this is even benchmarkable. then through the company review and more detailed analysis of what each company is doing and what is important while doing the manual or AI analysis in the modern world, and what is less important and what is rejectable and what is acceptable, to the PLI and selecting the right profit level indicator and the way to apply that profit level indicator and where in the range you should be targeting or should be testing. And then, of course, it also comes down to, if you even do all of that right, you need to provide all the details of that process and document this process along the way. And that's where we come in with our tool. So I will now shamelessly present our solution as well, which facilitates and substantially increase efficiency of the whole benchmarking exercise. Because as you know, benchmarking is super labor-intensive process where you need to manually review often hundreds of comparables. And that's not something very exciting to do, especially if you're taking more serious approach to benchmarking and where you really start thinking about those details and nuances of what to accept, what to reject. That's where AI is very helpful, and our solution is coming in. The way it works, so I'll just give you a brief overview of how the solution operates. We take over from the database, so you still go to your database, export the initial set of companies, and import that data set into our solution. And then you apply filters on top of the database filters, and that's often the case that you want to narrow down the search further before going into the more detailed analysis of the companies with extreme financial values, with some other parameters that Sven will briefly show in our solution as well. Then it's about reviewing the comparables. That's where the most of the time is spent. About 80 to 90% of the time of the whole benchmarking process is spent on manual reviewing the comparables. And if you want to review them seriously and run through several scenarios, that it takes even more time. And that's the part that we are automating, where our algorithms review the comparables and suggest accept-reject decisions. And you can iterate quickly on different accept-reject criteria and see how that impacts your selection. So in my example of olive oil distributor, using our solution allowed us to quickly realize there are not enough comparables in the profile that we thought initially makes sense. And we could quickly expand the search into other products and services and functions or other geographies. And then finally, exporting the report into the clear, structured, also branded format, which reflects the identity of the firm that is preparing this benchmarking study. So that's what our product is about. And now I'll hand over to Sven to show quickly how the workflow looks like, but also highlighting the core interesting features and things that we recently added that make this process even stronger and better.
Yeah. So, well, our solution is web-based. So this is the homepage. Here you can quickly go to your recent benchmarks. We already prepared one for this webinar. So this is about digital marketing services in Europe. As Borys said, you start by going to your own database and uploading that data to our solution. That's all done using with the help of AI, so that's very efficient to do. Then you can apply filters from within the tool. So our advice is to do a bit of a broader selection inside the database, so you can play around from within the tool a bit more. You can apply qualitative filters, but also quantitative filters, and even see how values are distributed in your set. So that's also interesting. So in this case, you see that there are 4 loss makers, and you can easily exclude those extreme loss makers, but still include the less extreme ones, which is a very reasonable approach in my view. For each filter, you can provide justifications. So that's one of the most important things you need to do within your benchmark. So why are you applying this filter for this benchmark? And now you have all of that rationale directly in place. What's also notable is that you see the range at the top right. So when you make adjustments, you directly see the impact of those adjustments on your range. So imagine that we don't want companies with 2-year loss streak. We can exclude them like this and see the impact on the range. In the next phase, in the web search phase, we perform the actual web analysis. So here we're going to search for the right website for a company. We use the database provided website as an input, but we also do some validation on whether this is actually the most appropriate website. And sometimes we actually find a better website for the company, and then we also notify the user that we've used a different website with the reasoning why we use this website. We also immediately see the screenshots that have been created of this website. And finally, we create descriptions that are tailored for transfer pricing. So descriptions with quotes directly from the website that show, hey, this is the products and services that the company offers. This is the functional profile, and this is the structure or the legal structure of the company. That all of these things help you to make a comparability decision. Then for some companies, we cannot find data, and then we reject them based on the fact that there's just no data available, with evidence again on that there simply was no website for this company, or that the database description was not sufficient to make a proper decision. Then the next step, we perform the accept-reject analysis. So here the user defines an accept-reject strategy. Again, we help you define this strategy with AI. And based on that strategy, we make we suggest a decision for that company. So in this case, we see that this company provides online property listings and search platform. So that doesn't sound like a digital marketing service. Then you can dive into it and click on the actual quote that was used to come up with that suggestion. So you can validate that quote, and you can even see it on the screenshot. So you actually see on the screenshot the quote that was used for this decision.
And the screenshots are also now translated, right, Sven?
Yes, so that's a nice addition. So in this case, it's a UK-based company. So let me first reject this company because I agree with the AI. But here we have a German company. So this has a German website, but our screenshots, as you can see, is now in English. So that can be very convenient to do this these checks. Again, so you can quickly, so this one, for this company, the products and services are accepted, but we see that independence needs review because that's the rejection reason. So here you see the rejection, and you indeed see that the company is part of a group with operations in other countries. So that seems like a good reason to reject this company. And then finally, you can export it to either Excel with all of the findings that we've created during the analysis, or you can directly generate a report in your own branded style. So you provide some details and then click on generate and save the settings. So now within 10 to 20 seconds, you have your full report. And this really allows you to do an end-to-end analysis within 1 or 2 hours and do that extra fine-tuning steps for which you may normally not have sufficient time. You can finally really go into the details of the comparables that you've selected. And of course, we rate this benchmark with 5 stars. And then we can look into the actual report really briefly. So here we have the report. As I said, it's branded and it's all, it contains all of the relevant information to document and defend this benchmark with the justifications for the filters that you've used in the benchmark. So that can be very convenient.
It is very convenient indeed, because it also reduces the need for manual copy paste and reduce the chance of error of copy pasting things in the report, which I did myself. All right, I think we're done, and thank you very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you, and just if you are interested in having faster, more consistent, better benchmarking studies for your transfer pricing practice, if you're a tax administration and you also see the value in more automated, faster reviews of benchmarks, feel free to visit our website and book a demo with us, and we will be happy to walk you through. Thank you again for joining us, and thanks, Sven, for taking a significant part of work from me for presenting all the material. It was
great. AI cannot do.
Yeah, still AI can do that, maybe in the future.
Yeah, probably it can do it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.
You even left.